Welcome to our class. In this class, I would like to teach you how to do column layout using the CSS float property. What we have here, we have two block level elements. This is our nav, which contains an unordered list, and this is the main element. One thing I would like to stress, and I cannot overly stress this, when you're working with containers, especially if you're doing page layout, put either a border or an outline around that container so you can see where it is. If I did not have this red square, you would not know where this container ended. Therefore, you can never really judge whether your layout is correct. I always work with the outline property because it does not add width to the overall dimensions. So let's take a look at the HTML. Here we have the normal flow of the document. Our nav is on top of our main. And what we're going to do, we're going to stack these two next to each other. Now, in order to stack two things next to each other, one of the items has to have a width. If they were both 100% width, there's no way they can line up together because they're both taking 100% of the parent container. So one or the other has to have a width. If you're setting more than one container, such as 3, side by side, then the chances are you're probably going to have a width on all of them. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the left value to the float property here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to be playing with the CSS in order to demonstrate how floats work and how you can learn how they work. This property is very dependent on everything else. It's dependent on the width of this, and other factors. It may work fine in one situation, and in another situation you may have problems. So I'm trying to show you how to think through this. So I'm going to go to the CSS, and here is my nav element. And there's my outline, similar to the border. Now I'm going to uncomment my float left to show you how it works. A little differently than the image. Now notice, these two containers did float. However, once the container on the right has exceeded the height of the container on the left, it's going to go underneath it. And that doesn't look good. So how do we get these things lined up exactly together? Well, there's two ways of doing it. The first way is to put a float on the second container. And here again, a float left. Now, while that worked okay, we obviously have a problem. Now they're both lined up together, but because we don't have a width set on this one, it's going to default to being as big as it needs. Therefore, we have this issue that we looked at last week where the content underneath, which is the footer, will come up and wrap alongside of it. So here again, if you're using a float left and a float left, you need widths on both of those containers. Rather than setting a width works good if you have more than 2 containers. What we're going to do, we are going to set a left-hand margin on the rightmost container. So here's nav. Nav has a width of 100 pixel, and I need to get rid of this. But we want it to be at least as big, if not wider, on the margin here. So this margin has to be equal to or greater than the width of the container. The left margin is set on the rightmost container, meaning it's going to give you a straight edge all the way down. And here again, we do not have a width set. The width will just by default be as big as it needs to be and fill out the whole container. And in that case, everything works fine because the float will clear, this wrapping will automatically clear because there's no way for the footer to wrap up here. Now technically you could have probably put a right rather than the left margin. You probably could have put a float right, which is going to stick the right container to the right-hand side. But here again, we're going to have this wrapping problem. So what you would need to do, you would need to clear that float, and we could probably do that in the footer, and by saying clear both because we have a right and a left, here it clears it. Now the problem here again is that because we're telling it to float to the right, it's sticking it to the right. We tell it to float to the left, it sticks it to the left. Because there's no width here, it's going to be as big as it needs to be. So rather than having to calculate width all the time, you always need a width on one of them. And it makes sense to put the width here because we know how big we want our sidebar to be. The best solution is to put a left margin on the right container and not to use a float. So here we go back. We don't need that clear here anymore. And I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to put my margin left, set to 150 pixel. So when it comes to lining up two containers as columns, the rule of thumb is one of the containers has to have a width. The second container, it's better to not give it a width. Let it default to the remaining space available. However, it needs to have a left margin set which is equal to or more than the width of the container with the float. Therefore, it will float, plus it will set that margin, and because the margin is on the right, it will extend all the way down and give you that nice sharp razor edge. So here again, you could have these touching, and you could do some CSS where it looks nice. So this is the concept of two columns.